Hey, it's Lou here with our second episode in this special series of conversations from Shade, supported by Hauser and Wirth. And in this series, we'll be exploring unencumbered voices in curated spaces, inspired by the life and the work of Sir Frank Bowling.
It was the first time in my life that I had the opportunity to get down and do what I wanted to do. I mean, like I'm 24, and I had the most marvelous, satisfying experience. But I mean, that was one of the moments in my life when I knew what I wanted to do, how I was going to go about it, etc.
This 3-episode series, released throughout the summer, will provide a collaborative platform for diverse perspectives, investigating freedom of expression today and throughout art history. Today, I'm delighted to say that my guest is Michael Ohajuru. Michael is an art historian and senior fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, where he leads the What's Happening in Black British History programme, fostering a creative dialogue between researchers, educators, curators and policymakers.
And when you look at it, the abstract expressionism, there's a kind of that tension that these artists created through figure and form and colour. Frank captured that so wonderfully.
He speaks regularly on the Black presence in Renaissance Europe at the National Gallery, Tate Britain, the National Archives and the British Library, highlighting the overt and covert Black presence to be found in the National Art Collections in London. OK, let's go straight to the conversation. Enjoy. Well, we're here to talk about freedom of expression in curated spaces inspired by the life and work of Frank Bowling. And we had a chat earlier before we recorded this session about Bowling's work. And you talked about his positioning within what you call the implicit-explicit framework of the Black artist and the Black subject in British galleries. So before we talk about Bowling's work, in particular within this context, can you just tell us a little bit about this implicit, explicit framework that you use to view art currently?
Well, it's based on the image of the Black in Western galleries as a seminal text, multi-volume text, which look at the Black presence in Western canonical art. And in London, we've got some of the finest collections of Western canonical art in Europe. And in there, I like to go and find the Black presence. But to find that Black presence, there's a number of ways I kind of have to deconstruct it or search for it. The first, as you said, talk about an implicit and explicit. Quite simply, it's there, you can see it. The Black presence is clear. Like, for instance, the Black Magus in the adoration scene, well understood, because there are many, many hundreds of them, and there's almost 15 of them in the National Galleries collection, for instance. But also, there's an implicit presence in terms of, in its simplest form, where did the money come from for this picture? And often you can source the money back to enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade, and that's where the money came from, particularly in the 18th century, Britain's age of celebrity and the rise of the common man to become an elite, and the money that fueled that launch. Much of it came from the trade in enslaved people across the Atlantic. So those are two, the implicit and explicit I talk about. There's also a journey that we go on from the very start, from the 13th, 14th, 15th century through to the 21st century. At the start of this journey, the Black presence is often is a servant, as a slave. He's a subject of economic capital. But as we move through time, today he's the artist, he or she, is a creative cultural capital. He's defining our times, reflecting how we think and feel about the world, how we understand the world. And in terms of Frank is the very end of my journey as I take people up from the National Gallery in the works in the 15th, 16th century, through the Renaissance, through to the Enlightenment and the age of celebrity with artists like Sir Joshua Reynolds and others, right through to today. He's at the end of that journey in Tate Britain, where we see Black artists creating art for themselves. So that's the journey going, implicit and explicit, and from subjects of economic capital to creators of cultural capital.
Mm. I wanted to talk about the narratives that are placed upon his work, and I mentioned that because there's a quote here that I have where he said, "I don't know what Black or Asian art is. I only know that art is art." So by the time I was editing this, I'd become aware of some context around this particular quote, and I think it situates this conversation in a useful way. In 2019, Tate Britain held bowling's first major retrospective, and in response to this, as part of a seminar at the Tate, Turner Prize nominee Oscar Murillo criticised the fact that this was the first retrospective of bowling's work. Murillo was saying two things. Firstly, that there had been no retrospective up until that point, and he also added that the retrospective framed bowling in the context of his life, citing the lack of discourse and depth in discussions around bowling's work. And according to a BBC article at the time, Bowling responded by saying that he wanted the show to focus purely on the formal aspects of his work rather than his life story and race. He stated that, "I don't know what Black and Asian art is. I know what art is art." So there's some context for you, and to me there's a difference in the wording of those quotes. The difference is that the quote I first heard seemed to show Bowling placing himself in a post-racial context, where he wanted the show to focus purely on the formal aspects of his work. And this isn't wrong, of course, but what the full context shows is an artist coming up against the preconceptions of an institution based on race. And I think that says so much about his criticism of labelling the artist. And this is so interesting to me because we label creatives so much today based on their identity. I'm thinking in particular about how Frank expressed the tension he felt at having narratives placed upon his work, and his desire was to work outside the constraints of what was considered Black art. And I think that was very telling of the cultural and political times in which he was working as well. And he was an active instigator of dialogue on this subject. He addressed the critical invisibility of Black artists, and I think it'd be really nice if we could spend a bit of time now exploring how his work fitted into the narratives of the times in which he works.
You know, Frank is such an important character in my in the journey that I take on the black artist, and because he's an artist first, and that's what makes him so special for me, because I see him as the first artist of color who was recognized for himself. Now, it wasn't an easy journey for him. Very famously, you know, that exhibition in the Whitechapel Gallery where his work was rejected.
It was called the New Generation 1964, and it was the penultimate event that propelled bowling from Britain. 2 years later, he was chosen to represent Britain at the first World Festival of Negro Arts in Dakar. He had had enough, protesting that "I'm not a Black artist, I'm an artist," going on to say that the tradition I imbibe and the cultural ramifications are British, and at which point he left for New York.
I use him as an example of how he was an artist because he was a contemporary with Hockney, with Alan Jones, Bridget Riley. He was their equal. Yeah, he was excluded from the exhibition. Robertson said, "England is not yet ready for a gifted artist of colour." Let's just break that down. A gifted artist of colour. He was a gifted artist. He was reflecting his times. That's abstract expressionism, and he was creating work which spoke to the time. And when you look at it, the abstract expressionism, there's a kind of that tension that these artists created through figure and form and colour. Frank captured that so wonderfully. So Robson, when he rejected him, he knew he was going on. And what I find just so maddening, Robson is the gatekeeper, not ready for an artist of colour. How does he know that? He is a gatekeeper. Frank was his own man. And he created work which spoke at the time, but also speaks to us today. You know, these are wonderful pieces, wonderful works that reflect his work as an artist. And I love the journey he went on, sense of, okay, I'm rejected in England, let me go to America. And he went there and he met brothers who accepted him. But even over there, they were looking for this idea of black artists. And to your point, Lou, he was rejecting that. He railed against that because he didn't and doesn't think there is such a thing as black art. So for me, there's no question. He's first an artist, and you look, some of the work speak for themselves. Particularly his map work, and perhaps we'll come on to that later. His map paintings, they're just exquisite paintings that speak to the ages, speak to us. So no, first and foremost, he's an artist. We could discuss the Britishness, what that means,
Yeah.
or and equally the blackness, what that means. But first and foremost, when you see his work, it reflects the times and who we are and how we relate to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the matte paintings. So what was the framework in which those paintings were created in terms of the political times and what was going on socially and culturally?
He's looking back to his origins, and he uses the stencil of South America, and he lays on that the Guyanese flag, and those colors and that stencil creates some idea of his origins. I had the pleasure of attending the Tate exhibition, the retrospective, absolutely brilliant, and the map room where they brought several of his map paintings together was just an exquisite experience. These paintings are big, several meters long, several meters high, big paintings, full of color. And I love this so much. I brought the T-shirt literally because Tate have a T-shirt. The one I brought was Polish Rebecca. Have you seen the Rothko room where you've got the Seagram murals at the Tate Modern? There's almost a religious experience when you go in that room because the lighting is quite low, and the paintings, they have a presence all of their own. That map room was very similar to that. It had an aesthetic and mood, a feeling, all of it. So the paintings together, they spoke. Such was their presence and their vibrancy.
You've made me realise how much I miss galleries and how much I took them for granted before lockdown. And you said, like going into that Rothko room with the low lighting is like a religious experience. It's just like, I'm not a religious person, but going to galleries, does feel like that. I'm so glad everything's opening up. So I think just what you've described there will make people excited to get back into galleries. We missed it, right?
No, so much so because these paintings have a presence of their own, and sometimes you can't articulate it. But I talk about, now forgive me for this, I talk about WTF art. I'll leave your listeners to understand what that means. But art, when you look at a painting, it draws you in. Often you don't understand why. And Frank's paintings, particularly his matte paintings, are that you look at them and they have a movement, a drama, a mood, all of their own. As I say, I'm going back to Polish Rebecca because it's my very favorite, not just for the because it's Frank and matte painting, but the color, it's predominantly purple. It looks like, so this T-shirt looks good. I wear it with pride because the colors suit me, and also the artist suits me. But no, let's step back a bit. When you look at these paintings, like, as I said, like Polish Rebecca or his other painting, I was looking at one the other day. There's it's about the Thames. But you look at that, it triggers off water, flow, movement, riverbank. You look at it and you're just drawn in that WTF sense. The kind of the painting sucks you in, asking you questions, answering questions, creating a mood in the moment. So it's hard to articulate and put into words. Just that you're in the presence of something. One of my old art tutors used to talk about the painting being a human being and having a humanity, a presence of its own. And coming back to your point about visiting galleries, when you're in the presence of these works, they look at you looking at them. And there's a kind of a spooky kind of harmony, particularly these great works. Great in terms of size and great in terms of content.
Yeah. This idea of unencumbered voices and this massive imposing, when you were talking about those paintings, like this imposing kind of expression that kind of can overwhelm you. And I wanted to call this series Unencumbered Voices because I was thinking about Frank's ideal when it comes to freedom of expression. And I'm thinking particularly about this in the art history context and the curated spaces context. So on the one hand, within the curated space, through time, again, we're talking about the narratives and identity placed upon artworks by artists of colour. By talking about our identities, we kind of express our position quite strongly. You know, it's a strong foundation, and this is who we are, and this is where we're coming from, and this is what we want to say because of who we are in our work. And that does help to define the dialogue around the work. But then, by the same token, I'm concerned, am I kind of part of the system that is perpetuating the recycling of these discussions, which in turn could lead to further stereotyping? I was talking to another friend who's a creative on this subject, and the whole question of discussing these themes of identity, and, you know, we're on interview panels and podcasts, and she came back to me and was like, listen, this whole thing is a trap, and maybe we need to move on, and maybe this is not progressing us now. We've had these conversations. Maybe as a community don't often take the time to step back and reassess and look at where these discussions are taking us. And so I'd like to finish by reflecting on where we are now in terms of the impact of these discussions and how maybe you see this playing out. So, you know, you give talks about the Black presence within British galleries. Just imagine, like, if I just sent you 10 years or 50 years or 100 years ahead when you were giving those talks, what do you hope that you would be saying about the Black presence in British galleries? Big question, but, you know, we can always dream.
First, there's history, factual history. You know, there's a painting with a Black presence. What does it mean? There's a king there, there's a white king, a Black king. What does that mean? So there'll always be a need to understand that presence from a historical point of view, from a kind of a factual point of view, interpreted. Well, what does this mean to us today? In my talks, I like to focus on the fact that the paintings had a meaning then, and they have a meaning now. I would like to think that in 50 years' time, people say, well, so what? That's how they thought. Move on. Because those paintings from the 14, 15, the Renaissance don't inform us today of thinking is more or freer. We don't put people into boxes anymore. We don't, because he's Black, then X, Y, Z, or because she's Black, we don't have all these things fall upon their head. We're much freer in our thinking. We accept it. So for me, 10, 15, or 50 years' time, it's a kind of acceptance of the Black presence. And having said that, though, coming back to this history thing, some of these paintings are historical records. They're records of how people felt at that time. Let me just give you an example. I'm just doing some research on Hogarth. On Hogarth's Marriage a la Mode with the Black presence. And that's a statement of Britain in the 18th century. Hogarth saw it. It's a historical statement. It's a record which can be interpreted just as text in the National Archive can be interpreted. They state the times. Moving forward to today, we're very different times from today, so we can look at it objectively. So that would be my hope, that people can be objective in 50 years' time. However, coming back today, is it okay to be a Black artist? Of course it is, in the sense that you're first an artist, you're expressing your times, feelings, and emotions through your art. But then, if part of that is your lived experience of being a Black person and the challenge that it presents, that I see as no different from Palestinian art today, where Palestinians do art which reflect the oppression they feel in their search for a nation. That presence cannot not inform their art. There's a very glib expression that says, you cannot not communicate. So that's what artists do, they communicate. Now, if that manifests as a Black oppression, well, so be it. Other times, artists, I'm coming back to Frank, they express a moment in time, a feeling, a sensation, and using color to kind of help us understand or or respond to those emotions. 50 years' time, I hope they'll be seen as historical facts, and artists will continue to be artists, reflecting who they are and how they fit into the world.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming to talk to us today about unencumbered voices in curated spaces. It's been an absolute pleasure. This series, inspired by the work of Frank Bowling, is sponsored by Hauser and Wirth. Editing and mixing is by C.A. Davis, and music is by Brian Jackson. If this conversation has inspired you to explore the work of Frank Bowling more, I've added links to his work in the episode's description. And come and say hi to Shade on Instagram at shade_podcast and on Twitter at shadepodcast1. And check out our website too for all of the episode archives. I've been your host, Lou Menser, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.